Before heading into recess this week, the House narrowly passed a blueprint for Democrats' $3.5 trillion budget proposal. That plan had been at a standstill after a group of 9 Democrats threatened to tank the bill unless House Speaker Nancy Pelosi agreed to first hold a vote on a bipartisan infrastructure bill. This breakaway caucus was working against the intentions of party leadership, including the Biden White House, to try and prioritize one bill out of a pair that was intended to be passed in tandem. CBS News political analyst Jamelle Bouie writes in the New York Times, the 9 Democrats making Nancy Pelosi's life harder are making a big mistake. He explains the party holding the White House almost always loses seats in the midterms, and Democrats, quote, can fret and tinker and try to save yourself, or you can do as much as possible with the time you have in power. Voters may not reward productivity, but they almost always punish failure. And now Jamelle Bouie joins me now from Charlottesville, Virginia. He is, of course, a CBS News political analyst and an opinion columnist for the New York Times. Jamelle, thank you for taking the time to join us and break down this entire complicated issue. Explain your theory here. Why are these 9 breakaway Democrats making things harder for their party and themselves?
So I think that they don't understand themselves as making things harder for themselves. I think they see themselves as being in a tenuous place because they don't want to vote for a large spending package, which is what the reconciliation bill is. They don't think they'll be able to defend that package. And they think that if they vote for it, there's a good chance that they may lose their seats. What's mistaken is that they don't really have that much control over their political fate. Like you said, the president's party almost always loses seats in the midterm. To the extent that that doesn't happen, it's because the president themselves remains pretty popular. And so my view is that the smart thing for these Democrats to do would not be to find ways to kind of reduce the size of the bill or even keep it from passing in the first place, but to make sure it gets passed and do everything they can to bolster Biden's agenda, because that is probably the only hope they have for surviving whatever midterm backlash comes next year.
You say that they're making a big mistake and that people almost always punish failure. Let's put ourselves in their shoes for a minute. What exactly do you think these 9 Democrats are trying to gain out of this process, and what impact could that have on Democrats' priorities?
I think that as far as what they're trying to gain, it's likely both reducing the size of the package, making it something that's a little more comfortable for them to support, or bolstering Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who will also have a hand in shaping the package and also want it to be smaller. I also think that there is this view that part of how one establishes one's independence is by, taking a stand against one's own party. And I think this is a good deal of this, that by presenting themselves as antagonists to Nancy Pelosi, who is known as a very liberal Speaker of the House, they can maybe get some bipartisan bona fides with their independent voters in their districts. But again, the problem is that elections are just completely nationalized. This might have worked a decade ago, 2 decades ago, when voters at the district level may split their tickets, may make a distinction between the person in the White House and their own congressperson, but that doesn't really happen anymore. That the situation right now, if you're an elected lawmaker, is that you rise and fall with your entire party. And so from that perspective, it's sort of counterproductive to do things that might make it more likely that your party ends up failing to pass its agenda.
Yeah, and doing so, they're really exposing some serious fault lines within the Democratic Party. What does this tell you about the next year and a half of governing from this Congress?
I mean, what this suggests to me is that this is sort of these next few months will likely be the last serious period of governing, that there's a lot of anxiety about next year's midterm elections, and that Democrats kind of just want to have something in hand to take to voters next year. And if that's the case, then I think that their best bet is just to take as much as they can as possible, which would mean passing sort of the full package of reforms here. I'll say, to this point about fractures within the Democratic Party, what is interesting is that these 9 members who are from the moderate and conservative end of the House Democratic Caucus don't really represent the entire moderate faction of the House Democratic Caucus, that there are other moderate Democrats who have taken the view that it is counterproductive for them to stand in the way in this manner. And I actually think that there's a bit more unity than you might see, or at least a bit more willingness to go through this process of negotiation between moderates and progressives for a common end, the common end being passing some legislation that people on both sides want to see happen.
Yeah, no, we're showing this calendar right now. Lots of deadlines, lots of votes that still need to happen in the next month. It's a busy month, September. While we have you here, I want to ask you about last night's unsigned Supreme Court ruling that struck down the CDC's eviction moratorium. We'll have more on that, what it means for those behind on rent coming up. But I know you have thoughts on this. The court's trend of issuing major decisions from what's known as the shadow docket. Tell us about the issue you see here.
Sure. So the shadow docket, for those who aren't familiar, is just a process by which the Supreme Court can take cases that might even be currently going through the lower courts and essentially decide them. Go through the facts that have been collected thus far and make a decision, and they can, either they can stay something, they can, as we saw last night, strike down something, and there's no requirement in using this process of hearing oral arguments, of even putting forth an opinion, and certainly not signing an opinion. So you can sort of make far-reaching decisions about live legal issues without going through the process that we usually associate with the Supreme Court decision. So far, this has mostly been done on statutes, but not necessarily constitutional law. But that's where we are. And my issue with this is that it's an abuse of power, more or less. That yes, the Supreme Court has this authority, and we seem to be okay with it having this authority, but striking down statutes in the middle of the night with unsigned opinions, without hearing oral arguments, for decisions that will affect millions of Americans, seems to me kind of incompatible with how we imagine a representative system is supposed to work. That at the very least, advocates for supporters of the CDC's eviction moratorium should have been able to make a case to the Supreme Court. So I have broader critiques of the court, but I think in this particular situation, it is very troubling to me to see the court time and time again make major decisions in a process that really lacks any transparency or ability for recourse.
Yeah, especially something that impacts millions of Americans. Jamelle Bouie, thank you so much for your time and, as always, your insight.
Thank you so much for having me.